A favorite quote of mine sets the tone perfectly for this exploration. Credited to poet Theodore Roethke, that quote is, "What we need here are more people who specialize in the impossible." If that doesn't make sense yet, I promise you, by the time we get done today, it will. I think I define the word superhero differently than most. I know I define it differently than I did as a kid when I had my nose in an endless string of comic books. As a grown man, I look around through the world, and especially its history, to see those people that are outliers. Men and women who achieved the impossible, did the dangerous, focused on the helpful, and invented methodology that has outlived them by generations and sometimes even by centuries. Those are my superheroes. And this video is about a handful of them that over a period of about 80 years defied logic, sometimes good sense, those far more educated, and changed the world, making it better and safer. These were the masters of disaster. They carried names like Tex Thornton, Myron Kinley, and Red Adair. There are more in this story, but those three stand above all others, and you're about to see why. These three men were able to stand in the presence of, attack, and successfully thwart the power of Mother Nature in its most raw and destructive form. They fought wells shooting fire hundreds of feet in the air under thousands of pounds of pressure, and did it with their bare hands, inventing the standards and practices that would become the industry standards on the fly. They would make equipment in the same manner, and they did it with a demeanor that cements them as heroes of the common man. At least it does to me. It was their work, it was their passion, and it was their greatest satisfaction to bring order to chaos and then bring the powers of an angry earth to heal. They became internationally famous from their work, wealthy beyond their earliest dreams, and with all that came its own complications. None of these men were saints, but they did sure seem to have spent their lives fighting disasters springing from an underworld of incalculable size and strength. So let's get to it. I used a multitude of resources to put this video together. As you'll see, I scoured hundreds of newspaper stories from all over the world through the decades for a lot of information in the project. I also used the books Call Kinley by Jesse D. Kinley, An American Hero, The Red Adair Story by Philip Singerman, along with resources like the fantastic oilystuff.com, which is an incredible blog about the petroleum industry that celebrates these titans of oil well firefighting like none other, newsreels, and films like Rig 20, which can be found here on YouTube. All of those plus other resources have combined into what you see today. To get started, we have to make a quick stop in the 1800s. When Edwin Drake completed his famous Pennsylvania well on August 27th of 1859, the American petroleum industry was officially born. When it then burst into flames on October 7th that same year while being inspected by a man holding an oil-burning lamp with an open flame, it was also the country's first oil well fire. How appropriate. Now, as that 69-foot deep well produced about 20 barrels of oil per day, the fire, after it was done consuming the wooden derrick and everything around it, was pretty easy to be put out with dirt and manure and whatever else could be heaped upon it. Now, it would also serve as an example of how early drilling and oil exploration was part gold rush, part business, and constantly operating under the lurking shadow of disaster. As you'll come to understand, once the industry spread nationally and began making millionaires out of people and billion-dollar corporations out of small companies, the question wasn't about if wells would be on fire, it was about how many would be on fire at once, where they were, and what the heck puny little human beings would be able to do to put them out. Early wells were typically shallow affairs that operated at relatively low pressures. And now by the early 1900s, that had all started to change as the wells were reaching ever deeper, and as they did, the stakes were raised higher and higher. The issue? Something called a blowout. To describe a blowout in general terms, picture a well being drilled toward a pocket or an underground reserve of oil or gas. As it's approaching the oil and breaks through the bottom layer of rock it's in, there is a layer of gas on top of it, or in the case of a natural gas well, there's an actual pocket of gas in the ground. Now, if that gas is at an incredibly high pressure, it can take the entire drill, well casing, and anything else in that hole and launch all of it backward out like a rocket. In doing so, it would also typically destroy the derrick that was holding all of the works together, and if any of that sparked or had any sort of heat and friction involved, it would typically ignite the entire well, and you would have an effective volcanic situation of a well burning under pressure, shooting fire hundreds of feet in the air. Now, this could be true of a natural gas well or an oil well, and in the early days of an industry, what we now call a blowout was sometimes called a gusher, and there was really no means to control it. Now, in the modern day, we have what are called blowout preventers, and these are massive, instantly acting valves designed to choke off a problem before it becomes a catastrophe, but back then, there was really nothing to stop this. Doubling down on the problem was the fact that, be it oil or gas, these wells were incredibly flammable, as I mentioned before. They would be filling the air for a large radius around the well with vapor that could be ignited by so much as a lit cigar. These catastrophic incidents and their very nature of cataclysmic destruction often led to workmen losing their lives through fire, flying drill parts, or even exposure to the gases coming out of the ground. These blowouts were the equivalent of pulling a cork out of a supercharged bottle of champagne, and instead of being measured in milliliters, it was measured in untold millions of gallons of oil or stratospheric volumes of gas. Now, all of this leads us to California in the early 1900s and to the doorstep of a man named Ford Alexander. Ford Alexander had the most dangerous and interesting job a man could hold on the oil patch at this time. He held the job entitled well shooter. Well shooters were hired by drillers or well owners, typically when they had reached oil or gas, sometimes called pay sand, but the flow of that pay sand was being restricted, slowing the production of a well that could otherwise be moving higher volumes. That could have been something stuck in the well casing, it could have been a blockage at the end of the well itself, or it simply could have been some kind of a pressure situation that needed to be, quite literally, blown out of the way. The well shooter's job was to solve this problem and to do it in a pretty spectacular fashion. The well shooter's job was to fashion what was known as a torpedo, because it literally looked like one, and to send said torpedo down the well, have it explode, and remove the restriction that was slowing down the flow. You open the flow up, the well becomes more productive, and everybody's more happy. Now, in the early days, this craft was completed with dynamite, but by the time Ford Alexander was on the job, the shooters used nitroglycerin, and lots of it. The firm of Allison and Berry employed Alexander, and they were the most in-demand shooters in the oil fields of California. Along the way, they had also hired a man named Carl Kinley, and through his employment, he'd worked his way into the position of being Alexander's right-hand man. Carl had a rather rambunctious son named Myron, who was still a young boy when he went to work in the oil patch, but young Myron idolized his dad and soon became obsessed with following in his father's footsteps, wanting to work in the same industry, even doing the same job. In 1912, at the age of 13, Myron Kinley dropped out of school and went to work with his father in the Taft oil fields of California, where he got an education from the ground on down in the business of drilling oil wells. As it turns out, it would be the greatest decision the 8th grade dropout would ever make. Now, it wasn't long before he too was part of a shooting team, and in 1913, Myron, along with his father and Ford Alexander, did something that was recorded for the first time in the news. These guys managed to put out a burning oil well, however briefly, with a massive nitroglycerin-fueled explosion on purpose. Now, it may have been tried before, but as far as the historical record is considered, these guys were the first to consciously attempt to extinguish a fire with what amounted to gelatinized dynamite. Their explosion extinguished the blaze for about 5 minutes. As Myron Kinley would learn and teach the world hundreds of times later in life, it took a lot more than a simple explosion to keep these beastly torches extinguished, but at the time, no one knew any better. During this time in history, the only proven way to extinguish one of these fires and to keep it out was an arduous process that involved transporting large boilers to the area of the fire and by using massive volumes of steam and water, teams would soak and choke the fire out by robbing it of oxygen while simultaneously cooling the areas around the burning wellhead. While this was a proven method, it took forever. On the good end, it would take days, and on the bad end, it would take a week or more to get the well put out. All the while, the well was belching its contents toward the sky, costing the owners inordinate amounts of money. The use of nitroglycerin brought everybody's hopes up because it seemed like an instant fix, but there were plenty of issues on that front as well, one of which was finding people who wanted to work with the stuff. As incredible as it is to say, these guys would drive their old rickety trucks around with hundreds of pounds of nitroglycerin in them from job to job, sometimes nearly the length of the whole state of California, and we're talking before 1920. While there were reports of small accidents, there were none of roadside craters being created, so apparently everybody was on their best behavior. Unloading full train cars of this stuff was also a difficult assignment to staff, and that is not conjecture. As this news story tells us, these guys needed help to lug the stuff off of train cars a couple of times a year, and they could barely find anybody to do the work. Now, the method that the men used in 1913 would be the future, but it needed refinement, and young Myron Kinley would be just the man to do it. The problem is, he was still a boy, and he was still a boy with a looming war to fight. And there was another man, one that young Myron Kinley had never heard of. A well shooter who was born in Mississippi and nicknamed Tex was on a journey to become the first truly renowned oil well firefighter in the world. Tex Thornton, beyond anybody else you'll learn about in this video, is the one guy we can actually call crazy, and we can hang that tag on him because of his first appearances in the newspapers of the United States. In 1920, the awesomely named U.S. Torpedo Company moved Ward Augustus Tex Thornton to the Amarillo, Texas area in the position of branch manager. Freshly trained and highly motivated as a well shooter, he gained a near instant reputation as one of the best in the Texas Panhandle. But that's not what found him in the news. A sensational murder trial did. John H. Asher was a former member of the Amarillo Police Department and a Texas Ranger in 1921. Tex Thornton was in a car with Asher when he was involved in a bizarre altercation where Asher ended up shooting a man who was driving by him on the highway. Incomprehensible claims of booze and drunken behavior were brought up by Asher in his defense, and while Thornton's name appeared more in the first few stories covering this murder as being in the car with Asher, his name was mentioned less and less as time went on. Now, there's no record of Thornton testifying, and upon Asher's conviction, it was not mentioned at all. The ultimate twist in the story is that Asher was pardoned by Texas Governor Pat Neff. When questioned by a grand jury as to why Neff had issued the pardon, he simply said it was none of their business. But he did later explain that he felt Asher was in the line of duty, working on law enforcement when the incident took place, and he was simply trying to do his job and uphold the law, hence the pardon. With all of that insane mess over, Tex Thornton reemerges in 1922. And this time, the headlines actually fit the storyline here. He had gained some notoriety by extinguishing a burning gas well. He showed his inventive side with the approach to this particular fire. So as the fire was coming out of the well in multiple directions because of a broken wellhead, he fashioned a steel column that slid over the jets of the flame, forcing them up into one stream. Using some asbestos blankets he claimed to have found on the worksite, he was actually able to fashion a makeshift fire suit to walk over toward the burning well and manually close the valve that had been previously shrouded in fire. His inventive use of the steel fire funnel was certainly forward-looking, and his use of asbestos was a true peek into the future. In 1924, Thornton put out multiple fires along with his relentless well shooting exploits, opening wells that were underproducing or those that had been stymied with drilling issues. 1925 and 26 were again years where his stock continued to rise, and in many ways, he was the first man anybody in Texas called to fix a burning well. Tex Thornton got so good, he actually started advertising himself in the newspapers. 1926 and 27 were big years for Thornton. He was putting out fires regularly, and his name and death-defying antics were being published with weekly frequency around the country, and you can tell the guy was kind of feeling his oats. His plan to have 3 specially constructed dynamite-carrying airplanes made headline news. The airplanes would be able to carry 1,000 pounds of explosives, have shock-absorbing cargo holds, and allow him to be at more fires quicker. Now, there is no record of any plane being built, and frankly, Thornton, as good as he was doing in business, did not have the money to commission multiple aircraft, especially custom ones to be built for his own desires. 1927, the year of the crazy airplane story, would also be the year of Thornton's greatest public triumph. A massive gas well fire in Sanford, Texas, which had begun with a horrible explosion taking the lives of multiple workers on the derrick that was completely annihilated, was the definition of a Texas disaster. And Sanford was the definition of a Texas boomtown. And the little town had one road, and that one road led to the well. Rushing to the scene, Thornton found as large a calamity as he had ever seen. A 200-foot-tall fire, a massive crater caused by gas blasting the ground away as it escaped in different directions, and a terrified gathering of townsfolk. Donning his asbestos suit, he entered the hellish crater a total of 8 times, crawling through all the wreckage and destruction to locate the root of the fire. He had other men in asbestos suits working to pull equipment and debris away from the fire with long cables and trucks far away from the mess. The well was spewing 1 million cubic feet of gas per day. He assessed that 2 explosions would be needed, one to blow the twisted remains of the top of the well off, and the other to actually blow out the fire. Now here's where we get into what made Tex Thornton a true legend. His nitroglycerin was always hand-delivered to the base of the fire, and it was not detonated remotely. It was detonated by heat. Lugging a first charge of 50 quarts of nitroglycerin into the fire, he laid it down wrapped in asbestos. Clad in his suit, shrouded in steam, and soaked with water, he ran, lumbering as fast as he could, mentally counting to when he thought the explosion was coming, and then he heaved himself onto the ground, covered up, and boom! It worked. All he had to do was manage the same thing again and not kill himself, and he would be able to call this a success. So he pulled off his now signature move from so many fires again. Down into the mess, more treacherous moves through the broken and busted parts, and laying that second charge in front of a gathering crowd at the wellhead, he turned around, ran like hell, dove on the ground, and boom! The fire was blown out like so much as a matchstick. Thousands of people had come to watch this, and they actually had to dodge flying rocks, wood, and shrugged off busted windshields from the concussion of the explosion, but Tex Thornton, yes, Tex Thornton had done it. It should be noted that Thornton was not in the business of capping the wells. That wasn't his area of expertise. He was just there to put out the fire. The rest of it, well, that was left up to the drilling professionals. Tex Thornton went on a wild run of putting out fires through the late 1920s. He was a grandstander and a storyteller with the media, once claiming that a well-shooting torpedo he dropped down a well was then shot backward out the well high into the air, and he had to catch it, lest it land and blow the whole place to pieces. He also claimed that he was going through asbestos suits at the rate of 35 every 2 months, and that they cost him $315 in 1928 money apiece. Fact or fiction, it sure made for a good story, and Tex Thornton sure liked telling a good story. In 1928, facing massive fires in Corpus Christi and realizing he didn't have enough explosive for the job he needed to do, he called his wife, who oversaw the family supply of nitroglycerin, and asked her to tote 1,500 quarts 700 miles to him as quickly as possible. His wife, who had been previously quoted in the newspapers as being kind of annoyed she was never able to go on the jobs with Tex, absolutely and happily accepted the request. She grabbed a friend, and they made the ride jauntily, making their own newspaper headlines along the way. And yes, this is all real and actually happened. Here's the proof. It is incredible. Throughout the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s, Thornton was shooting wells, putting out fires, and keeping himself in the headlines. He made huge amounts of money, enjoyed spending it, gave generously to local charities, and supported the war effort vigorously. He kept ties with various companies in the oil and gas industry, the blasting industry, and by all accounts had a pretty, swashbuckling lifestyle. And that swashbuckling lifestyle came to a hard, ugly, and fast stop in 1949. On the road working as the president of the United States Nitroglycerin Company of Amarillo, Texas, Tex Thornton had stopped for some drinks after a long day at a roadside bar. In that roadside bar, he met a young couple about half his age. He left that bar with the young couple, went to a seedy hotel with that young couple, and was found by a housekeeper the next morning, the obvious victim of a violent end. Headlines around the country announced the manhunt, and while it was furious and netted some suspects, no one was ever charged or convicted with the foul play surrounding his end. After all those wild days in Texas, tens of thousands of miles of traveling with a trunk full of liquid dynamite, wearing asbestos suits into flaming wells and beyond, this was the way the music stopped for Tex Thornton. A wild end to a wild life. But what about Myron Kinley? When last we left him, he was a kid, a teenager working with his dad Carl in Fort Alexander in the Tate Field of California. He had been working in all aspects of oil field life, landing in the blacksmith shop, mending, fabricating, and building anything needed by the crews in the field. It was an incredible education, but he was still just a kid. Myron had a lot of growing up to do, and he did it in France, on the Western Front. If there's one thing to understand about Myron Kinley, it's that he was the anti-Tex Thornton in all the right ways, and the exact same type of guy as Tex Thornton when it counted on the job. Myron enlisted in the Army in 1917, went through basic training and artillery training, deploying to Europe in the summer of 1918. Myron was part of the 59th Coast Artillery Corps and saw combat duty from July of 1918 through the signing of the armistice on November 11th of 1918. He found his way home in early 1919. Empowered, emboldened, and enlightened by his service, Myron went back to California and met up with well shooter John Percival. The two of them had read fantastic stories about the Oklahoma oil boom, and so they decided to go to Oklahoma and ply their trade there, starting their own business called the Western Torpedo Company of Tulsa. Now, the Western Torpedo Company of Tulsa was started with the types of high hopes that ambitious young men have, and failed with spectacular speed by the end of 1919. Left with no money, an old truck, and some tools, that was what Myron Kinley had to move on his life with. He also, of course, had some nitroglycerin. He took those meager resources and founded the M.M. Kinley Company. With his old truck, his hard work ethic, and a dream, he was about to get to work shooting wells, and when there was a fire, as a helper, he would work on the fire, not as a leader or anybody with authority, but the fires attracted him and the challenge attracted him. Even at a low-rung job, it didn't matter. He loved the patch, he loved observing, and he loved learning. Interestingly, Myron Kinley had another ace up his sleeve that he had yet to pull: his time in the Army. Remember where it was spent? Yes, as an artilleryman. Multiple years of studying explosives had left Myron Kinley as the most well-versed man in the Oklahoma patch when it came to getting things done. Slowly and steadily, his small company grew. In 1924, 2 wells on the Cromwell oil fields of Oklahoma burst into flames simultaneously. The first was attacked by a traditional crew using steam, mud, and water to knock out the fire. It took 12 days. Sensing an opportunity, he approached the well owner named H.F. Wilcox with an offer. Kinley said he'd have the fire out his way in 2 days, and if he didn't, he would be owed nothing. Wilcox accepted. Kinley called his younger brother Floyd, who was just 20 years old at the time, and they devised a plan. Acting fast with equipment to remove all the debris and potential hotspots around the burning well, a nitroglycerin shot was figured. Its location perfectly planned to hit the well in a so-called mixing chamber area, which is the spot just at the wellhead where the raw gas is below the ignition point of the fire, and 18 hours after they were left to do the job on their own, they blew the fire out with an explosion. It was the quickest the two men had ever earned $500, and the brothers would now be partners for the long haul. They were 26 and 20 years old, respectively. The thing you really have to understand about Myron Kinley is that he wasn't just a firefighter who reveled in tempting fate on a daily basis. This guy was an 8th grade educated oil field genius who loved the industry to his core. When he was not battling flames and fury, he was inventing and patenting oil well equipment, some of which is still in use to today. The guy has dozens of patents to his name. In fact, the ideas were so good, and he was so busy in the field, he signed licensing agreements to many of the products with giant companies like Halliburton. Those companies would produce the products and pay him a licensing fee. He also studied explosives and how to use them incessantly. He worked on different blends, blasting caps, and safety procedures to advance his own cause and the cause of keeping himself alive. The guys did not quit, and the results began to show. In October of 1929, the brothers were called in on a fire in the Sinclair fields of Oklahoma. It was a straightforward job for them, seemingly impossible for normal people, but they handled it so swiftly and simply, company executives kept their number at the ready because something was bound to go wrong when you had an operation the size of Sinclair, and as it turns out, they were right, and it was a good thing they kept the number sticky noted to their desks. In 1931, they were called back by the same company and faced with their biggest task yet. The coal number 1 well in Gladewater, Texas. This well had not simply blown out, it had blown out and then ignited, and that ignition was blamed on a tool spark, and that ignition took the lives of 10 men instantly. Headed into the fray, the brothers could see the smoke from 20 miles away. Immediately taking command of the situation, they started out with an aggressive effort to use bulldozers and tractors to pull any and all debris away from the wellhead. Days of arduous acetylene torch cutting work was done within feet of the fire to cut up the remains of the derrick and remove it. As pieces of the drilling rig were still in the well, this was the most complicated situation the brothers had ever been in, and it was about to get worse. Well in the belly of the mess one day, a huge iron beam fell on Myron Kinley, shattering his ankle and trapping him. His brother Floyd was able to wrestle him out and drag him to safety, but otherwise, Myron would have died on the spot right where he fell. For days, the crews cut, dragged, and battled the wreckage of the derrick. The battle to clear the well itself slowed progress of trying to put the fire out, but Myron, even with his broken ankle, showed back up on crutches. Annoyed by the small pace of his ability to get around on the crutches, he actually got on horseback to shout orders and command the scene. An initial nitroglycerin charge was used to blow the contents of the well out, and that worked, but when it did that, they also managed to start a small forest fire, which the guys put out, and that kind of took away a little progress from the main job, but it kept the forest from, burning down. The next challenge came when it was time to put out the main fire. The earlier charge that was used to actually clear the well of the broken parts inside it was relatively small, but the one to put out the main fire was going to be a big one. And it was going to be so big that it would not be able to be manipulated by a single guy or even a couple of guys into place. So on the spot, Myron came up with one of his signature inventions, which he would simply call the hook. Using spare metal pipe lengths that were on the ground welded together with a rake-like head, this was the perfect delivery method for the 150 pounds of nitroglycerin he figured would be needed to snuff the fire. Now, water was flowed through the pipe and out the end that would dump down on the barrel of nitroglycerin to cool the charge as it was put into place. Now, we ended up using a 55-gallon drum, put 4 50-pound nitroglycerin charges in it, and positioned it over the well where he wanted it with the hook, and then had Floyd hit the detonator handle. 200 hours after they started, the fire was out. 300,000 barrels of oil had been swallowed by the flames, but the well was out, it was capped, and it was back to producing shortly after this whole mess died down. The more than a half dozen lives lost in the initial explosion was the lasting tragedy of this well. And the injury to his ankle, well, that would be far from the last and far from the most serious for Myron Kinley. 1931 would officially mark the beginning of Myron Kinley becoming a true international star. In the spring of 1929, a fire in Romania, simply known as the Moreni Well Fire, erupted. It was by far the largest fire burning in the world, and it had been the source of not just physical destruction, but of a double-digit human toll. Kinley, as he so often did, bet on himself and traveled to the site, unasked, to offer his services. The Romanian government, despite the fact that the fire had been burning with no relent for a year and all efforts had failed to put it out locally, as well as a death toll that had now extended into the double digits, did not feel as though explosives were the right approach, and they did not want to work with Kinley. They were kind to him, and they were respectful to him, but they did not want him to be touching the fire, and they sent him packing. Through 1930 into 1931, he and Floyd, along with their guys, had put out 50 fires successfully with their explosive methods, and so he decided to take another plane ride. In 1931, the government relented in Romania with stipulations. Burning now for 2 years, the suction and the wildness of the fire had created a crater some 200 feet wide and nearly 70 feet deep around the well. Myron agreed to a deal that provided he was to extinguish the fire and cap the well or receive no pay. It also only allowed him 2 helpers in the hole with him at any one time, and one of them had to be Romanian. Immediately, you'd suspect that his brother Floyd Kinley would be the helper, but that was not the case. Floyd was at home running the business in the United States, which was as busy as it had ever been, and so a man named Grady Chupp was called in to be Kinley's right-hand man. Myron surveyed the apocalyptic-looking situation and surmised that dynamiting the crater would cause it to fall in toward the fire, and that would be step 1. Step 2 was going to be to fill the entire thing with concrete, and step 3 was going to be igniting 2 blasts simultaneously, one which would be over the wellhead and one would be underground in a tunnel next to the well itself, which should choke the fire from multiple points, or so he hoped. After 3 months of work, with the well spewing 250 million cubic feet of gas per day, the stage was set and Kinley delivered. A fire that had ended a government, many lives, and an incalculable natural resource disaster was tamed. The well was capped in another very dangerous, high-stakes, and frankly Herculean effort. Now the well would continue to produce gas into the 1970s. His cruise home in 1932 back across the ocean had to have been a moment of triumphant reflection. That said, the guy was still on crutches from his Texas ankle disaster. In 1936, the brothers were called to Venezuela and confronted with a problem virtually no other human had been forced to solve before. How do you put out an oil well 3 miles offshore? That was the case on Lake Maracaibo. Their solution was both simple and impossible sounding. They wanted to place a completely constructed oil derrick into a location adjacent to the fire and then drill a relief well to cut into the bottom of the existing one, pump in mud and water to choke the thing out, and move on with their lives. With people calling them crazy, but with no other ideas to execute, for the first time in history, a 25,000-pound oil derrick was made on the shore, floated in complete fashion 3 miles out, and placed in the requested location. As all involved watched over the next days and weeks, the derrick was set up, the drills were put in place, and before they knew it, the fire was out, and the Kinley boys had succeeded again by doing something that no one else had ever done before. Later that year in 1936, Myron and Floyd were called to Bay City, Texas to take on a seemingly standard fire. This one did have a couple of wrinkles, though, and one of them was a bent-up well pipe that was over the wellhead that could only be blasted out of the way. What was to be a relatively simple and straightforward operation would prove to be the moment that the oil field, who Myron Kinley had proved the master of so many times, would fight back. The charge he was preparing to blow the pipe out of the way exploded prematurely. It immediately killed the man standing next to him and caused him permanent damage to the right side of his body. His right leg would never properly function again, to the point where he had to have cars adjusted to left foot driving, and his body was filled with shrapnel. His recovery was long and arduous, but his end goal was to return to the oil patch and fighting fires in whatever capacity he could. Meanwhile, Floyd ran the company, and it was relentless. While still in the depths of recovery from his fully shattered leg and all the other injuries acquired in that explosion, the Kinley boys were called to the Goliad oil field in Texas in early 1938 to deal with a burning Dryer No. 1 well. It had blown out in early March and erupted in flames shortly thereafter. Once again, it was a common scene for the men to approach. Myron, who was still very much slowed by his bum leg, was left out of the hot zone, and Floyd ran the job site. Working alongside 3 other men, they were clearing debris. Out of nowhere and without warning, the well pressure spiked and launched all kinds of heavy steel and iron parts out of the ground and into the sky. Massive parts and hunks of white-hot debris landed straight on top of Floyd like he had a magnet attached to him. He didn't survive. Myron ran into the conflagration and helped pull his brother out, but Floyd Kinley died on the way to the hospital. The oil patch had now not only taken Myron's leg and mobility, but also his brother. He was distraught for a significant period of time. He had seen the whole thing happen and even risked his own life to get Floyd out, but there was no saving him. And yet, despite his broken heart, he went on undaunted. Not only did he go on, his next major job would be one of the most difficult and celebrated of his life. By the time he walked onto the job site, the oil well near Refugio, Texas, had been out of control for more than 2 years, and in that time it had created its own geographical landmark on the Earth. The Greta crater, as it was known, had already swallowed a highway and stopped a railroad, and it was about to financially swallow the company that owned the well whole to boot. What made this one so hard was the fact that Kinley wasn't just dealing with a wild well, he was also dealing with a flood of sorts. When the well first blew out in 1936 at a depth of 4,500 feet, firefighter H.L. Patton was hired to get the well back under control. Patton was a famed oil well firefighter in his own right. One of the things that made Patton's operation so unique is that he would attack fires with a whole brigade of his own family members, uncles, cousins, and brothers. But despite their best efforts, they could not stop this monster, and things quickly went from bad to worse when the crater around the well grew so fast that the entire drilling rig collapsed into it. Remember, that was in 1936. After that, the crater filled with water at an estimated rate of some 500 barrels per hour. The crater filled so fast, the water was its own erosionary force, and in little time, this crater was 600 feet across and 70 feet deep, boiling with millions of cubic feet of escaping natural gas and constantly being fed water by some deep spring. In 1939, when Myron Kinley got to the job to tackle the issue, he arrived and set forth a massive pumping operation. The result? Well, the water line would get low enough that the well would burst into flames again. Whether it was friction, whether it was old debris, or something else, every time he would get the water level down, they'd have a fire, and it would be a big one. Systematically clearing debris and making room around the wellhead seemed to solve the reignition issue, and so then he set up a milling operation to fix the well itself and begin to cap it. Multiple attempts were made to pump cement, mud, and water and other stuff down the well, but nothing worked. Relief wells drilled adjacent to the one that was blown out were unsuccessful, and then the kicker. The crater, seemingly on its own a living entity at this point, began to rapidly fill with fresh water. Another 6 weeks were needed to pump that mess out, so in November the final assault was mounted. Myron Kinley built a cofferdam inside the crater to keep the localized area dry around the well, and the team was able to get control of the well by adding hundreds of feet of pipe over and around what was there. That allowed them to facilitate the installation of control valves, and then in November, the whole thing was cemented in an effort to choke it off, which worked. On November 4th, 1939, the Greta crater and the well inside it was declared dead. This was about 9 months after Myron started working on it and 2.5 years after the initial well failure. That happened again in 1936, and this was 1939, and that thing had been blowing its lungs out the entire time. Insane. Kinley was paid $25,000 for his trouble and actually given a mineral lease on a piece of land of about 20 acres. He sold the land to a driller, got 25% profit on the returns, and turned the Greta crater job into the longest residually profitable job he ever completed. We now move to Texas in 1941. Myron Kinley has just driven up on an oil well fire in his brand new Ford truck to find a drilling crew sheltering from the heat a few hundred yards away from the burning fire. Myron Kinley needed another set of eyes to walk up to the fire with him. And when he asked the group of workers if anybody would do it, one man quickly said yes. His name was Paul. His friends called him Red, and his last name was Adair. After assessing the situation, the guys worked the fire together, Kinley as the boss, shouting orders and directing the crew. By the end of the fight, Kinley knew that he had found the right man in Red Adair. He was not at all fearful of the fire. He worked with the precision and care under duress, and most importantly, he followed orders. Myron Kinley had been wanting to find a guy like Red Adair for 20 years. And as time would tell, over the next 20 years, Myron didn't waste his shot to give the man an education like none other on earth in the art of oil well firefighting. Myron Kinley didn't hire Red Adair on full-time to start, but he was hired on a job-by-job basis, and it was almost a very short career. Adair was blown from the cellar of a drilling rig to the height of about 80 feet in the air when a well surged and blew off the blowout preventer stack on top of the well. He traveled all the way up in the air holding it, released it, and crashed back down to the ground with a thud. He told Myron Kinley it was a wild ride, and from that day forward, Kinley assumed that Adair had been blessed by the oil field gods and viewed him as such. Working for various service companies and with Kinley on fires, Adair was piecing together a pretty good living, and when there was no work in the field and nothing was on fire, he and Kinley would travel out to the middle of nowhere and experiment with nitroglycerin. How to form it, how to do different jobs with it, how much volume was needed to do certain things. They learned a ton about shaping charges and using different size charges for their various encounters in the field. Adair had a seemingly bizarre, innate understanding of explosives and how they worked. He perfected directional blasting in specific ways years before anybody else, and he did it by feel and by simply empirical knowledge. Rather than making explosions happen, Red Adair's next big job was stopping them from happening at all in Japan. Adair had attempted to enlist after Pearl Harbor into the United States Army but was rejected because of a hernia. Attempting later in the war, he was accepted and assigned to the 139th Bomb Disposal Unit, and they were sent to Japan, quickly sent into the field, and they were sent to find and disarm unexploded munitions that had been dropped on the country. Let's just say there was plenty of work to be done. By the end of 1946, he came home and went looking for Myron Kinley. When he found him, he was shocked. During 1945, while he was in Japan, Kinley was called to a fire in Venezuela. During the debris-clearing portion of the job and without warning, the area Kinley was standing in was engulfed in flames, and it was in this moment that Myron Kinley had a question answered that he had asked himself so many times. Would he be able to run with his bad leg if he was caught in a bad situation? And the answer was no. Trapped and unable to run with his bad leg, Kinley basically walked through the blaze. His soaking wet clothing began to effectively steam him alive as he walked. His back on fire, Kinley found shelter and then found himself lying face down in a Venezuelan hospital bed for 6 weeks. Kinley's back was very, very badly burned, and his back would be a mass of scar tissue for the rest of his life. After this mess, he hired Red Adair as his full-time right-hand man and lead firefighter. The two would absolutely dominate this industry for a decade. They bounded from job to job across states and continents. From Montana to Iran, they were the world's most wanted well control and firefighting experts. Kinley wanted to return to California to live, so in 1949, he placed Red Adair in charge of his Houston base of operations, built himself a house in Bel Air, and moved out west. This allowed him to have some relaxing time at home between jobs, but frankly, there was never that much time between jobs. In 1951, after attempting to slow down and retire, Kinley was called to Iran. He was called there to extinguish the biggest fire that country had seen in 40 years, if not ever. The well he was called to was in a mountainous region of the country and was hard enough to even get to, let alone to build a plan to fight fires. Because water was a necessary part of any firefighting operation, they had to go find it, and they did. 20 miles away. So, 20 miles of line were laid to get a reliable water source, and that water source was pumped all the way to the fire. Between getting equipment and men and the operation and then all of these things working together, the job took about a month to be successful. One of the things I always like to think about when considering the lives of these men is how they simply were able to get to the places they went. It was one thing, and it is one thing in the modern world, to get on an airplane in California and fly to some far-flung place. You can get there in not too much time. But consider this. To get to Iran, Myron Kinley left his home on Tuesday, then flew to New York City, left there on Wednesday, and through a variety of different means ended up at the fire site on Friday. A journey of about 7,000 miles took the better part of a week. I'm not sure you could do it a whole lot quicker today with how remote that area is, but I do think you could probably do it in a little bit more comfort. Now, the job required the digging of ponds to hold massive quantities of water, more heavy equipment and tractors, bulldozers, and cranes than anybody had ever seen before, and a relentless around-the-clock approach. Once the pits were dug, the reservoirs were full, the tractors were outfitted with their heat shielding and asbestos, and everything was in place. It was a month-long, full-court press led by Myron Kinley, and it netted the results they wanted, and netted another massive payday for Kinley Company. As he was across the world, Red Adair had been running the Texas operation full bore, fighting domestic fires and snubbing out-of-control wells in the USA for the entire time that Myron was in Iran. Interestingly, the Iran fire was also documented in a film called Rig 20. Now, that film can be viewed here on YouTube, and I recommend you checking it out. It's an amazing window into the approach and practice of what Myron Kinley had all but perfected with his own brains and his own physical suffering through life. Fires in France, Italy, and domestically across the country and across the ocean kept Kinley, Adair, and their company not just busy, but absolutely straight out. Adair was working across the globe for 200 to 250 days a year, each one of the 200 being about as dangerous as the next. There was always something on fire. The work they were doing in the Gulf with offshore fires brought them some of the most significant headlines and experience that all the men involved would use, and they would use that experience in their own careers going forward. Now, it's amazing that through all of this, Red Adair was simply an employee of Myron Kinley. His profile was elevated with every victory, and yet he was still happy to work for the old man that he admired and who had taught him every one of the fundamentals of their profession. As they continued their globe-trotting work, it was not without hard times. In 1953, Adair was badly hurt by a poor crane operator on a job in California, his pelvis all but crushed along with other serious injuries. In the hospital for 2 months, the recovery was painful, but successful. It is impossible to recount every job or even half the jobs that Adair and Kinley worked on, many at the same time in different parts of the world, but it is simple to say that Kinley had complete trust in Adair to run the job safely, efficiently, and effectively for not only the business but for the men involved on the job sites. Kinley paid Red Adair a salary, but one that got more and more handsome as the years went on. But as the old expression goes, all good things eventually come to an end, and such was the case with the employment of Red Adair by Myron Kinley. In 1959, Red Adair went out on his own, and it would be the first step to fully realizing every ounce of potential he had, not just a firefighter, but as a promoter, an innovator, a leader, and if some international celebrity just so happened to come along with all of that, so be it. Myron Kinley and Red Adair's split was amicable. Kinley was slowing. He wasn't done, mind you, but he was slowing in his advancing age. He had done enough, suffered enough, and had nothing left to prove. His last big fire to fight personally was in Japan in 1960, and after that he stepped away from the field. He spent the next 15 years as a lecturer, inventor, innovator, and a man who continued to love the industry he had helped make better with all of his heart. A life of taming fires and disasters, defying the odds with rough-and-tumble crews across the globe came to a peaceful end on May 12th of 1978 when Myron Kinley breathed his last. It was a truly incredible life. During the true heyday of the Kinley Company, it wasn't just Red Adair who brought the operation to new heights. Two other men were wildly instrumental, Asger Boots Hansen and Edward O. Coots Matthews. When Red Adair went off on his own, Coots Matthews came with him from the jump, but Boots did stick with Mr. Kinley for a while before joining his other two friends, and the three of them would do so much work with so much success they'd be loosely portrayed by one of the most famous actors in American history about a decade later. There was only one major issue at the start with Red's business. There was no business. Despite his handsome salary and earnings from Kinley, Red Adair spent money with the speed in which he made it. When the Red Adair Company began, it had $10,000 in the bank, some coveralls, and far more expenses than income. On the verge of a financial collapse, the company landed 3 jobs in a single day in the later half of 1959 and saved itself. If not for those 3 jobs, we'd not be having this conversation. As it would turn out, those 3 jobs didn't just save the little business, it shot it into the national consciousness. You have to remember that people had known the name Red Adair as a supporting actor, if you will, in the cast of Myron Kinley for years through the 1950s. And through those 1950s, his name would appear somewhere in brief news stories about fires he had put out or working as an assistant to Kinley, but now he was the leader, he was the boss. And with that role comes the aura of near superhero status, and to a degree, Red Adair relished it. The work was flying in internationally now. Boots came out to work for the company, and for a solid decade, these 3 guys were it. Unrivaled, uncontested, and without any competition in business, the Red Adair Company was about the only place anyone of consequence called when stuff went really bad with a well. One of the signature jobs of Adair's life came in late 1961 in the country of Algeria. The area was known as the Gassy Tuile, and as part of the largest known natural gas field in the world at that point, it was a very desirable place to drill wells. One of them, officially known as GT2, had blown out, caught fire, and now stood as the most fearsome gas well blaze in recorded human history. The flame shot 800 feet into the air, consumed 550 million cubic feet of natural gas a day, and was visually recognized by John Glenn as he orbited the Earth. Yeah, that's big. As Algeria was controlled by the French at this time in history, he dealt with French officials for his needs. They gave him carte blanche. Any and all he needed was his. And the fire was quickly named the Devil's Cigarette Lighter. The logistics of this job were absolutely wild. He ordered about a dozen massive Caterpillar bulldozers. He had water wells dug to feed 40,000 gallons of water per minute at the fire. Water reservoirs were designed and built to hold millions of gallons, and they were made about a mile from the fire itself. Roads were made, cranes were delivered, and as all this was happening, Adair left for another fire in Bolivia with instructions for his crew. He'd be back, and they needed to stay on task in the all-important job of removing the debris around the wellhead. Making relatively short work of the fire in Bolivia, Adair got on an airplane and flew straight to Nigeria. There was another fire there, and the Algeria disaster, as far as he was concerned, was being handled, so he prioritized the Nigerian fire, which he put out, then had meetings, then checked in on things, and then, in April of 1952, got back to Algeria to set up the final assault on the Devil's Cigarette Lighter. After months of work, the field of battle had been fully cleared off and everything was ready to go. The next and kind of final phase of the project in terms of putting the fire out was to figure out the logistics of the nitroglycerin shot. They settled on an incredible 750 pounds of it inside an oil drum, which would be covered in asbestos and be constantly deluged in water at the end of the hook as it was put into place. On Saturday, May 28th of 1962, they detonated the charge and blew the fire out, effectively 6 months after it first ignited. Now, the final phase of the job would be the most dangerous. The well had to be trenched out to a depth of 20 feet and a radius of 80 feet. The wellhead itself had to be cut off and then replaced, and all of this had to be done without making a single spark or introducing enough heat that could reignite the whole mess. They used water-cooled buckets on their excavators. They used a sand-coated cable saw to cut the well casing, and the work was done properly, methodically, and without incident. Placing the well under control, the job was done, and it was international news. This was an American story that Americans needed at the time. Adair, the man who had come from nothing, had worked in railroad yards, had been the lowest man on his company's totem pole, was now conquering the unconquerable. He was doing it with bravery and gumption, using all of those skills to invent new techniques as he went along to advance the science of his industry and dealing with new situations on a daily basis. The United States was a country questioning itself in the early 60s, and in Red Adair, they saw a rugged, slightly rough around the edges genius that was both charming and strong. Red Adair was the perfect man for the moment, and the public ate it up. Even better, the Devil's cigarette lighter was just his opening act. The work, both domestically and internationally, came at a furious pace. Adair was now a rich man and a stable man, which was what he had dreamed of his whole life. He had boomed and busted with the best of them, but now there was enough to lock down a future. In the 1960s, he'd be involved in projects from Texas to Kuwait and even on secret jobs for the government that lacked in detail. The Red Adair Company had a brand as strong as Coca-Cola at this time, and it was absolutely astonishing. These guys, as I said before, were it. And the proof came in the late 1960s with the making of the movie The Hellfighters starring John Wayne. Lots of it was shot in Baytown, Texas. Lots of it was based off the life and times of Red Adair along with Boots and Coots, and all of it pointed back to this heroic profession that Red Adair had pursued with passion his whole life, which was now glorified in the motion pictures. Did it get any better than this? Red Adair's business wasn't just confined to the field either. His company was now manufacturing a wide array of products for the drilling business, and through the 1970s, Red, Boots, and Coots were life-risking rock stars, oftentimes working multiple jobs simultaneously in all corners of the world. But as we all know, sometimes size can work against good teams. In the 1977 time frame, depending on whose account you read, rising tensions between the three men either led Boots and Coots to quit and start their own company, or saw Red Adair firing them over some sort of primal disagreement. The fearsome threesome were broken up, and worse, at least to start, they were in competition as Coots and Boots immediately went into business for themselves. And adding to Red Adair's problems was a Mexican disaster called Ixtoc 1 that left people wondering if Red Adair was capable of even doing this job anymore. On June 3rd of 1979, hundreds of miles off the Texas coast, a well known as Ixtoc 1 blew out in spectacular fashion. Located over 100 feet below the water line, the well was instantly spewing 30,000 barrels of oil per day into the ocean. It would become the world's worst oil spill at this time, and also a massive political football with governments and politicians trying to dictate the terms and place blame on each other. Red Adair was one of the guys that got a phone call. Upon his first assessment, Adair decided that the best course of action would be to bring in additional drilling rigs so that they could put down relief wells, which would siphon the pressure and volume off of the main one, allowing those wells to be managed and the main well to be capped. One Texas-based rig was brought in and one Mexican rig was brought in. Now, supposedly, the Mexican government favored the work being done by the Mexican drillers, and the Texans were starved for necessary equipment and resources to complete the job. By late June, Adair had conceived of and had installed a capping solution for the top of the well, but this turned out to be a disaster. After a couple of hours, the pressure buildup in the casing caused it to explode, which then moved the root of the leak even deeper under the water and complicated the whole thing even more than it already was. Now, the failure of the cap raised international concerns and caused wild well experts from all over the globe to chime in, questioning everything Adair had done, what he was doing, and basically claiming that the old man had lost his touch. As is the case when something is run by committee and is getting into maybe a desperate situation, many of these harebrained ideas were actually tried to the tune of tens of millions of dollars of cost, and all of them failed. Ideas like dropping lead balls down the well, making a massive funnel to put underwater, and doing other things that put so many people's lives in danger that some divers were actually killed during these schemes and trying to execute them. And meanwhile, it was Adair being pilloried in the media for not stopping the mess. It had gone on for so long and in such volume, the oil was starting to wash up on the Texas shoreline, and the situation was truly critical. After the management of the Pemex company that oversaw the well was broomed out, and some were actually sent to jail, the new leadership employed all of Red's earlier solutions, and they went with the relief well strategy in the location he wanted it, and it worked. By the spring of 1980, the disaster was done. Ironically, the capstone portion of this operation that the world would never see was the complex system of undersea valving that Red Adair had designed and that had been placed on the top of the well to finally cap it off and put it under control. If people had been able to see that, and if the details were fully shared with the public, the opinion of Red Adair's role in this entire situation would likely be different, but as it stood, his reputation was damaged from it all. The oilfield business was in a hurting state in the early 1980s, and competition in the space Red Adair once existed in alone was now fierce. Smaller, more nimble companies with younger men at the helm were eroding the regular work base that Red had created. Things were okay, but just kind of middling along. One year was a little smaller than the last in terms of revenue. And then 1988 came along, and with it the grandest redemption Red Adair could have ever dreamed of. All it took was the most massive, out-of-control, and dangerous job he'd ever agreed to tackle. The North Sea is one of the harshest environments on the planet. On a good day, it's incredibly mean. The sea is never calm, and the weather is typically rotten. It's also home to a massive supply of oil under its bed. That massive supply of oil drew the Occidental Petroleum Company to place a rig in the North Sea and to go probing for it. That rig just so happened to be one of the largest and most advanced in the world, and it had to live in that rough-and-tumble environment off the coast of Scotland. It was named the Piper Alpha. 229 men at a time worked on the platform, and they oversaw 36 wells that were all plumbed into one central location. The platform was capable of moving 300,000 barrels of oil per day when things were good. On July 6 of 1988, things were not good. The sound of a massive high-pressure leak of gas filled the air and terrified the men on the platform. Sitting 120 miles into the ocean, in water nearly 500 feet deep, escape was by helicopter or ship, and neither were handy at the moment when this leak broke out. On top of all this, their platform was 10 stories or more above the surface of the water. Even if they needed to abandon it, simply making it through the jump to the water would be a feat in and unto itself. The Piper Alpha platform started blowing up at 9:30 p.m. Multiple areas exploded first, and as the damage and fire spread, other areas would explode. Communications destroyed, the control room gone, the men were losing their lives by the score. Completely and utterly destroyed, the only hopes were to jump and pray, and many did. Fishing boats, as well as the multi-service vessel Theros, designed from tip to stern by Red Adair, were there to help as well, but this was a human and mechanical disaster of unknown proportions in the industry, and it was just getting started. Theros held 300 men, could fight fires at 40,000 gallons per minute, had an 8-bed hospital, a machine shop, parts, tools, and manpower to help in any way, but even as well-equipped as she was, and she was well-equipped, this disaster was out of her scope by a ton. 166 men were lost, 66 men survived, and the behemoth oil rig was burning out of control and would until somebody intervened. Occidental called Red Adair. Adair got on the first plane he could find and headed to the scene. Along with him were the men who replaced Boots and Coots, a man named Brian Krause and another man named Raymond Henry. They were two veteran firefighters who had been able to fill the shoes left by Boots and Coots while continuing to help the company move forward. The three men made it to the Theros ship, and after quickly surveying the situation from afar, they rode in the small basket of the ship's crane onto the burning hulk of the massive platform. The men explored all they could, determined which wells were the most problematic, sketched out plans and ideas for the things they needed the machine shop to make them, and eventually Red Adair came to maybe one of the most difficult decisions of his life. At 73 years old, he was not going to be among the men on the platform doing the handwork. He'd managed the project from Theros, communicating with the crew, directing them, guiding them, etc. Watching nervously all day, day after day, and week after week from Theros, Adair shared his expertise and keen eyes with the men on the platform. The machine shop ran 24 hours, 7 days a week on Theros, making grappling hooks, work platforms, and A-frame supports, along with anything else Red Adair believed that they needed. The only thing that interrupted the men's work on the platform was a stretch of days where the wind was over 75 miles per hour and the sea had swells of over 35 feet. Krause and Henry managed to escape certain doom by total happenstance multiple times. There were several episodes where the men had come off the platform moments before a massive flare-up would have incinerated them. Occidental wanted to make sure they had a backup plan, so they had drilling ships start drilling relief wells to serve as a second solution. It would basically be like a race. Could the Adair men get to and kill the burning wells and then cap them before the drilling ships got done? The media thought they were bound to fail. The memories of Mexico and the length of the job just kept bubbling up, and Adair was wildly frustrated by it all. Just when it seemed as though they were in a losing fight, the conditions cleared. The massive water cannons of Theros rained down upon the fires, and the men were able to get them out, pump the wells full of fluid, and cap them off. Once they got the first one down, the rest were completed in 2 weeks, and it was over in so many ways. Red Adair took stock of his life after this. The amount of destruction and death on Piper Alpha made the conquering of its twisted and hellish end a sombering occasion, not the normal victory celebration. He was also finally coming to grips that he'd no longer or ever again be that young man carrying explosive charges under inferno-like fires and then running for his life. Those days had passed him, and with them, a part of his identity had passed along too. Red Adair was still the grand genius of his business, but his mind was finally his strongest asset, not his strong back. It seemed as though Piper Alpha would be the last great triumph of Red Adair, a comeback story for the ages. He was off to a quieter life, one well-earned and one well-awaited. The company would go on, he'd continue to oversee things, but the fearsome adventurer, he was going to retire, unless something came up. And we're talking about Red Adair here, so of course, and for sure, something did come up. That something was a little thing called the Gulf War, and the disaster left behind when Saddam Hussein decided to blow up as many oil wells in Kuwait as he could when his army retreated. If there was one thing that could bring a rich 76-year-old Texan with calloused hands, blotchy skin, and a fighter spirit back to the oil patch, it was the greatest collection of burning wells the world had ever seen. Estimates before the war sat at the potential for about 150 wells to be damaged or destroyed. The real-life number turned out to be 750. The premier firefighting companies from all over the world were brought in, and the North American contingent was led by Red Adair as well as Coots and Boots International, among others. Adair and his men were responsible for stopping over 100 of the wells on their own. They used water on some, dynamite on a few, and other methods, some improvised to get the work done as quickly as possible. Between May and November of 1991, these brave workers from all over the world, operating as a massive team, stopped all 750 fires or blown-out wells. 10,000 workers from 37 countries using more than 5,000 pieces of equipment, all in one, never-stopping, astonishing effort. Somehow, some way, this was how the universe saw fit to send Red Adair off into his truly well-deserved and not-to-be-broken retirement. For the next 13 years, he would enjoy his life before passing away in 2004. Of all the things Red Adair did, it's the one thing he didn't do which should stand as the most jaw-dropping part of his entire story. He never lost a man. To consider that not a single person who ever wore the bright red Red Adair Company coveralls died in the battling of wells, blazes, oil platforms, and Mother Nature herself is mind-boggling. The fact that he lived to nearly 90 is another feat that astonishes me, but the fact he was able to make an entire lifetime out of the oil patch, doing what he did with the people that he did it with, and how they did it, and where they did it, and not one of the people that he employed died, is absolutely unbelievable. This video could be 12 hours long, recounting all the incredible things that Tex Thornton, Myron Kinley, and Red Adair did, invented, tried, and innovated. Add in H.L. Patton and his family, and it could go even further than that. The people profiled in this video are the kind of people I consider heroes. Everyday men who had innate abilities. Things that they may not have fully understood, and things that they used in ways that so many of us cannot even conceive. The combination of bravery, courage, indefatigability, and relentlessness are things that I hold in high regard in my own life. And those qualities are impressive to have on their own, but when they're embodied in singular people, I become obsessed with learning about them. I hope you enjoyed this trip back into history, the history of three men who deserve to have a whole lot of historical weight placed on their names. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more earth-shattering, mechanical, world, gearhead, and high-temperature history.